Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a highly debated, honestly fascinating analysis of modern South Africa. We're going to be looking directly at the source material, detailing Professor Ndumiso Didla's highly provocative perspective on the country's current reality. We're breaking down his exact arguments and mapping out a theory that kind of challenges the fundamental ways we talk about history, politics, and society. Now, whether you agree with his conclusions or not, understanding the structure of his argument is absolutely crucial. Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, Why This Matters Today, and the Reality of Modern Mzansi. You know, academic theories don't just exist in a vacuum, right? They're born from the very real physical lived realities of people on the ground. And in modern Mzansi, which is just a colloquial term for South Africa, that reality is pretty complex. So that brings us to the crucial question driving this entire explainer. Why do indigenous South Africans still face severe levels of hunger, poverty, unemployment, and crime decades after the watershed election year of 1994? I mean, this is a question that completely dominates political discourse. For the longest time, the standard narrative has just treated these struggles as a failure of policy or maybe just a bump in the road for a newly democratic nation. But Professor Didladla, he approaches this from a totally different analytical standpoint. His answer to that question is shockingly direct. He literally says it would be surprising if we didn't. According to the source material, Dladla comes out guns blazing with this assertion. From his perspective, the hunger, the poverty, the unemployment, they aren't accidents. They're not just glitches in the system. To put it simply, he argues they are the entirely expected outcomes of how the system is actually designed. Moving on to Part 2, the core explanation, focusing on terminology and timelines. Now, to understand exactly why he thinks this is an expected outcome, we really have to look at the words we use. Dladla argues that terminology is absolutely critical. It's like a giant puzzle, and if we use the wrong labels, we fall victim to a miseducation and a rewriting of history that actually inverts the truth. For instance, he points out that using the term post-apartheid is a monumental error. Why? Because it obfuscates the truth by implying that a specific evil has been totally replaced. Instead, he insists on using the term post-1994. It's an accurate, completely neutral timeline marker. It just denotes a change in time rather than a total change in the systemic reality. So how does this incredibly precise language actually reshape our view of history? Well, here is Dladla's timeline. See, he doesn't view apartheid as this special, isolated phenomenon. Instead, he looks at it as a continuum. Step 1 starts way back in the mid-17th century with the initial conquest. Then, Step 2, the 20th century brings apartheid. But he describes apartheid not as some brand new system, but merely a different veneer, basically a surface layer put right over that original conquest. And Step 3, post-1994, the system simply shifts gears again into what he calls constitutional supremacy. And this brilliantly illustrates the real crux of his thesis. Constitutional supremacy, at least as defined in this specific context, is seen as a modern legal framework that essentially just repackages that initial 17th century conquest. By prioritizing this legal framework, Dladla argues the current system simply continues the historical subjugation of indigenous people, just under a shiny new name. This is exactly why he says it shouldn't be surprising that the socioeconomic conditions haven't drastically changed. In his view, the underlying engine of that original conquest literally never stopped running. Let's look at Part 3, the anti-apartheid paradox, where we analyze motives and bedfellows. So, how does this theory play out in real life? The source material asks us to look closely at the anti-apartheid movement. On one hand, we have the really common narrative that the white anti-apartheid drive was rooted in true allyship and a genuine quest for human rights for Black South Africans. But, drawing on the teachings of Steve Biko, Dladla presents a pretty stark counter-narrative. Neutrally speaking, his argument is that the push to end apartheid was actually an economic pivot. In other words, it was ended simply because the system had become way too costly and counterproductive for the profit margin. This leads right into a highly provocative claim highlighted in the source. Dladla argues that anti-apartheid and white supremacy make for intimate bedfellows. Yeah, it's a heavy statement. He uses this concept to explain how, from his analytical standpoint, someone can actively struggle against apartheid while simultaneously displaying deep levels of white supremacy. In fact, the source specifically cites Helen Zille as an example to illustrate this point. The idea here is that one can totally oppose the specific veneer of apartheid, mostly because it's no longer profitable, without actually opposing the underlying 17th century conquest. Which brings us to Part 4, defining true freedom and repudiating the conquest. So the crucial point is, If the current reality is just a continuation of conquest, and if events like Freedom Day are what Dladla calls a complete fallacy, then what does actual change look like? Well, for Professor Dladla, freedom isn't possible a single day earlier than when these specific, non-negotiable conditions are met. First off, the rights gained through historical conquest must be entirely repudiated. Second, land must be restored to the dispossessed. Third, education has to stop being a tool of indoctrination and instead actually liberate and humanize people. Furthermore, society has to value human welfare way over the profit motive, which means hunger must be completely eliminated. And finally, indigenous culture and language must be mainstreamed, not just sidelined. We've definitely covered a lot of ground today, unpacking a very uncompromising and striking viewpoint from Professor Ndumiso Dladla. And as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final overarching thought based on his focus on terminology. Do the labels we give historical eras reveal the truth of our reality, or do they intentionally hide it? It's a really powerful question about the words we use every single day and the histories we just blindly accept. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep questioning the narrative, and I'll see you in the next explainer.